Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. I thought today we'd have a look at an assortment in the Oncidium Alliance, including some actual Oncidiums, including a species. But just to go over some of the differences, but what I'm really after doing as we go along is we often get problems with orchids. We're all aware of this, and normally we can deal with them. Sometimes it's too far gone and we lose the plant. But what about switching that round the other way and trying to anticipate what could go wrong in the future and become more aware of it and perhaps preempt it and stop getting to that point where a plant turns into a rescue? Now, I'm not going over the fact that you bought it as a rescue, because that does happen. You know, like I say, you get your pot, you get your lovely plant home, get it out of its wrapping, and look in the pot and there's no roots. Oh great, it's an instant rescue. Well, obviously you can try and avoid getting that in the first place, but you'll have a job when you're buying online. They're not going to show you what's in the pot, and very few plants being sold online are in a clear pot. I wonder why. Anyway, so I just thought I picked out a few. This is at random, but it should cover the range, roughly speaking. There's some in here that are recently bought, some that I've had some time, some that I already know there are problems. So they've got to that stage instead of preempting them. But we can exclude a few relatively quickly. This is one of my twinkles. It was not doing very well in a pot, so I thought, well, we'll give it a go on a mount then. It's actually a named thing. Siku Marguerite, Chianzi Glory. Effectively, this is a twinkle crossed back with Soto Annum, which is one of the parents of the twinkles. So it's in there somewhere. It's twinkle-ish. But wasn't doing very well on a pot, so I mounted it. And since it was mounted, it's pushed out a lot of new growths, and I've just noticed a spike, which I hadn't noticed. I only watered that this morning. So it's pushed out quite a few new growths. Now, what could go wrong with this apart from getting scale? Now, if you exclude bugs, what could go wrong with this? And the answer is very little. Very little. So I can just keep that going. Now, it's got quite a lot of moss on it, and a fair section of live moss in there. The new growths that are growing now will mature and bloom. And then after that, this plant will stop growing. And it'll go through a period, mainly in the winter, when it's not growing. It's not producing new roots, the new growths have already matured, and the next set of new growths probably haven't started yet, and it's finished blooming. And if that happens in the winter time, that will be allowed to get absolutely bone dry and stay dry for a little bit. And there won't be much point in putting feed into it, because it won't be growing. So possible problems down the line would be putting too much food in that moss when the plant's not growing, because that could have an adverse effect on the root system. Bearing in mind the reason this wasn't doing well in the pot is it didn't have a good root system. And although it's growing better on the mount, it still hasn't got a good root system, but it will have. If you look at the base of that tiny new growth, there are signs of new roots, but it still hasn't established a good root system. This growth on the end here, closest to us now, is one of the maturing new growths that will probably produce a spike any minute. In fact, yes. And if you look at the shadow of that growth, it's got a spike on both sides. But that, as a mature growth, the roots have come out the end of the moss. So as between the new growths and the growths maturing, they produce roots. So there's still quite a few roots to grow on this. So that is not a problem anymore. That is just a look after job. And just take care in the winter if it's finished blooming and isn't growing any new growths, and don't keep it soggy. And therein lies, going back to books again, they'll probably read about Oncidium types, that they shouldn't ever dry out. Well, if they're not growing, you keep them wet, you'll rot your roots. And that applies to many orchid types, not just Oncidium types. So that's that one out the way. I'm doing the 2 mounts first. Right, this is a Miltonia, currently in bloom, Castanier. And what can go wrong with this? Well, it's too late, it already has. It was mounted again because it wasn't doing that well in a pot, and on the mount it took off like a little rocket, and it got left on the mount, and it's a very small mount. So where are all the new roots? Yeah, they're on the latest 2 growths that are blooming. This new growth round here with the bloom on has already started a new growth that I'm promptly bending here. Try and put that over the top. Don't want to bend me new growth, do I? But the new roots on this particular plant come out late. Yeah? So this rhizome extended further than last time. It was quite short the time before. This one quite long. This one quite long. Yeah? And so all the roots on these 2 new growths, bar very few, have come into the air. And as such, they won't stay hydrated properly. They'll lose their growing tips, which they already have in a lot of cases, and some will die back. Luckily, some of them made it onto the mount. Yeah? So if we want to anticipate the problems with this plant, the problems are down the line. They're not now, but they are going to come soon. So when are they going to come? They're going to come when the next growths mature and have nowhere for their roots to go because they're going to be here. The new growths are going to be that far away from the mount, and none of their roots will make it to the mount. So I'm anticipating dealing with that before such time as those new growths start to produce their new roots. So in the not too distant future, before we get into the depths of winter, that's got to come off its mount. Yeah? Some of these old leafless back bulbs can come off, and I'll be left with 2 plants because they won't be able to stay joined together and be successfully looked after. If I tried to put it in a pot, the width of the pot is that, and that's before the next 2 growths grow. Yeah? So the pot would have to be huge. Not good. Yeah, you can see it's not a deep rooting system, although it might have been if it got in a pot. Yeah, so we'll end up with 2 plants here, and on this particular case I suspect I might be able to get an additional bulb back here. Depends where the split is, but I'll have 1 mature bulb, another mature bulb, full set of leaves and a new growth growing that will produce its roots when it matures. So new roots to come here. Up this end we haven't got our new growth yet, but I suspect it won't be far behind. It'll be coming soon. Yeah, so I can anticipate the new growth. How long before new roots come? It's some time, isn't it? This one first. Well, this one's going to be a bit slower. Yeah, but whatever I do with this, and the pieces will probably get mounted. They may both go on the same mount, one above the other, growing in opposite directions. Yeah, but this time growing towards the centre of the mount, not growing from the edge of the mount outwards. So that's anticipating what's coming next. The problem's already there. It's being managed, but it won't be managed next time round. It can't be. There'll be too many aerial roots and not enough hydration for a plant like that. You can see the bulbs are getting bigger all the time. This latest bulb out here is the biggest one on the plant, and that one's not far off either. So that's anticipating problems in advance, knowing the way this plant grows, because I've had it a while, so I can prepare for it and deal with it. Right, other stuff then. This is one of the pieces of the giant Brassia, the sea breeze. I always forget the other bit. Varicosa. And it was a giant of a plant. It had already outgrown its pot, It had loads of new growths coming, all of which were right on the edge of the pot or hanging over the edge of it, so it had to be split. And it got split into a large piece over here with 4 growths. It got split into this piece, second piece, with 3 new growths, and another piece went to Insa in his box. Yeah. Now, the problem with this was trying to anticipate when the next set of roots were going to come, but I didn't want the plant getting too big and already growing over the side of the pot, so I took the risk of doing it perhaps a little early. And has it been successful? Luckily, yes. Yeah, these new growths are quite large now. They're only just producing their new roots, but they're doing it. Yeah, and there was enough older roots on there to support it until those new roots came. And these are big, chunky, fleshy roots when they get going. And I've just noticed down here, one of these oldest bulbs has started another growth. So whereas I thought I had 3 on this plant, I'll have 1 staggered behind. But yeah, again, new growth's quite large before the new roots come. Yeah, and those roots wouldn't have been very good hanging over the side of the pot. So that was anticipating what was coming next and doing it in advance to take advantage of what was about to happen. But it was a new plant for me. There was an element of risk. So big brassica, that one. And while we're on it, care for brassicas. They're up the bright end of the light spectrum for Oncidium types. Yeah, twinkles are average, Miltonia average. Some like quite bright light. Dependent. They're not all brighter light types, but Miltonia's generally a little bit higher than some of the others, but don't go mad, they will burn. Brassicas can take strong light. They can go up near Cattleya light and be happy. So that's that. Right, what else have we got? This is one of the newer ones that was bought. It hasn't been repotted. Reason? That's an okay media. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not smelly. If in doubt, get your nose in it. It should smell earthy. It should not smell like a mushroom factory, i.e. going off. And this plant, it's got a rather not very good bulb with only 1 leaf on back here. Here's a thought for you. They say the way to tell the difference with a Miltoniopsis is that the Miltoniopsis will only have 1 leaf growing out the top. It's not the only one. And I've got a Miltoniopsis species, my Miltoniopsis phalaenopsis, that has 2 leaves growing out the top of some of its bulbs. It's those books again, isn't it? When there's a rule, you'll usually find something that breaks it, messes it up. You know, it's like our English language. I before E, except after C, except when it's this word, this word, this word, this word, and this word. Yeah, teach kids that. Anyway, anticipating problems on this would have been media breaking down, yeah, and not knowing when the roots are going to come from this new growth. Now, when you've got a loose media like this, you can go fishing, yeah, you can dig around and possibly even leave that like that so that I can see the base of that new growth. That way we get to see when the new roots come. Now, if I wanted to repot it, because it's a new plant and it's unknown, it's classed as a Bialara, so intergenerics, got stuff in it, different types. But I would wait until I saw the new growths. But in this particular case, because the media is okay, it smells reasonably fresh, it is a suitable media for that type of plant, it can stay in the pot till the next new growth. So this one can be allowed to mature, probably bloom, produce some new roots, and we'll wait for the next one. Because when this one produces its new roots, I'll know at what stage the new roots come on this particular plant. So anticipating problems with this, not really. we'll let it go. So that can just stay in situ, just do its own thing without any disturbance, which is good because it's still got to get used to my environment. Although I've had it a little while, I haven't had it a huge amount of time. Right, up here, anticipating the problem on this plant, failed. I failed miserably with my Sotoanum and nearly killed it. I just failed to appreciate how vigorous it was. Should have known when I saw a pseudobulb produce 6 spikes with masses of flowers on each spike. Imagine the energy that the plant had to, give up to produce that amount of blooms, and the high fragrance. That all takes energy. It had a really good root system, which I managed to lose by letting it dry in between watering. It was a drinker. I failed to keep up because I stuck it in the same watering routine as my others. And this one was using its water up twice as quick because of its vigour. So luckily I managed to save a couple of pieces. There's one piece in there and this piece here. It's managed to push on some growths, and those are producing some new roots because it's got a lousy root system. There's hardly any roots left on it because they all died. But it's starting to replace them. So that was saved just in time, but I really do mean only just in time. I'm not going to be able to put that away one-handed. I suppose I could try and put it in from underneath. I normally lean over and push it in from the top, and that mustn't touch these Miltoniopsis because this had scale. I don't think there's any left on it, but I'm not letting them get on there. Those are fragile enough without getting flipping scale. Right, this one's in bloom at the moment. This is another Miltonia. That was Oncidium Sotoanum, so an Oncidium species, but incredibly vigorous despite being a species. You normally expect that sort of vigour on a hybrid. Sometimes the species are a bit slower, reluctant to do things as vigorously as some of the hybrids, but not that one. Right, Miltonia, in bloom. The problems on this should have been anticipated. They were, and nearly got it wrong. I'm not sure I'm going to get away with it. The 2 new growths on here that are currently in bloom were right on the edge of the pot. So I left it in its pot. I thought, that's all right, those roots will get down in there. And they did. And you might think, oh, that's a really good root system. Yeah, is it? Look at the colour of the roots. Can you see any growing root tips? That root system is starting to fail. Reason? It's probably the media. It's starting to go off. Unless there's another inherent problem there. Now, I'm a bit stuffed, because what I really should do now is take those blooms off. Reduce the effort that the plant has to do. But you have to bear in mind it's already produced the blooms now and all the buds are open. So maintaining them doesn't use much energy, it's producing them that uses the energy. But the next set of roots are going to come with the next 2 new growths that will be out of the pot. That really needs repotting now. And it'll be a risk because the roots on it, they look good, they're not as good as they are looking because of I can tell by the colour basically, they should be virtually white. Now, so a bit of browning on roots and a little bit of dying off in a root system is not a big deal as long as there's plenty of active ones left. Now those roots have grown and stopped. Reason not necessarily known, but they have stopped growing. Now that putting them in fresh media, it's a branching root system, might kick them off again. A little bit of a risk, yeah, but the next thing that's going to happen on that plant is the new growths will start on this lead and this lead. If nothing is done, they will be outside the pot, so that has to be dealt with. Yeah, so that's a problem already that will get a damn sight worse if the existing problem's not dealt with, because it will lead into a bigger problem. So that needs dealing with. Right, this is a relatively new plant. This is a Rossioglossum. which is probably a closer relative to the odontoglossums than much else. It's classed as a cooler grower, like the odontoglossums, but it does have quite a different look to it. Let's go around and have a look at some mature bulbs. The mature bulbs tend to lose the lowest bract leaves, just leaving quite a large fat bulb with 2 leaves sticking out the top. And they'll hold those leaves for a long time if the plant's healthy and happy. These new growths here have not started to form their bulbs yet. They've got their 2 leaves, and the 2 leaves coming out the top, in some cases, are now 3. So I was just looking at this one here. This has actually got 3 leaves coming out the top. Yeah, these bits will open up eventually as the bulb swells. These bits will open up, but they do tend to die back. They don't tend to last a long time. Yeah, with any other 3s. That's 2. That one's 2, and oh, that one's 3. So we've got 2 bulbs with 3 leaves. So this is a happy plant. Now, I hope it's got a pretty good root system going on in there, but the new roots from these new growths have already grown. So it's not going to have any more new roots until the next set of growths, and I don't know how long that's going to be. Now, I'm expecting these new growths to bloom, or at least 1 or 2 of them. They might all bloom, at which point the root system will be put under test. Now, if it's good enough and strong enough and vigorous enough, it'll take whatever the plant throws at it and be able to support that number of blooms, because the blooms on this are huge. I'm not kidding you, they're 4 inches, 5 inches across. They're massive. So they'll take some producing. It doesn't have dozens of them on a spike. Their numbers tend to be lower than some others. But I daren't repot it now because they're fragile roots. The roots on this are a bit like zygopetalum roots. They look thick and fleshy and strong, but you breathe on them and they snap. And they bruise, they're delicate. Even though it looks a big strong plant, the root system needs looking after. Cooler grower, and it's a nice plant. I'm sure it's going to bloom. The worry is, can that root system last long enough in that media so that it can be repotted when the next set of growths produce their new roots? But it's not too far away. It's in that cocoa media stuff, and it smells okay. It smells woody, so I'm prepared to leave that. Anticipating a problem will be that the root system starts to fail, and before the next lot of roots start being produced, and then the plant will be severely weakened. Let's hope that doesn't happen. The last one of those I had, got scale really bad, lost its root system because I repotted it at the wrong time, and it never recovered. I kept it going for years as a rescue, and ended up in the Night of the Long Knives back at the beginning of this year. That was one of the ones that went. So that's a replacement. Right, over here. This Miltonia, grown out the pot, root's not so good. I don't even know what this one is, but I think this is a Miltonia as well. Exactly the same problem. Looks like a pot full of roots, doesn't it? But look at the base of those growths. The roots are dying. The problem is already there. It's already happened. Now, that got potted up with a small pot. Yeah? Oh, let's put it in a small pot. It'll develop a really good root system. But to keep that root system going, it gets watered frequently. And there's not much of it. That media's broken down already. Yeah? And that problem is 3 months old. It should have been dealt with then. The chances are it didn't get dealt with because it was in bloom. Can I afford to wait for the next set of new growths? Could be dodgy. Needs dealing with. Right, then we come up over to these. Now, in amongst the Oncidium alliance, these are probably the most cussed ones, the Miltoniopsis. It's strange, and yet some people grow these like weeds. Now, how do you tell it's a Miltoniopsis? It's only got one leaf coming out the top of the bulb. Oh yeah? Drat those books. Anyway, in my opinion, this is potted a bit too deep. Those bulbs are just a bit too low in the media. The media is the coconut fibre stuff, very earthy, so quite compact. There's not a lot of air in there. So this is in the danger zone, this plant. It needs the media changed. Yeah? And the two growths, I was just going to say, thank goodness. This growth here is maturing but hasn't bloomed. Let's see if there's no spike. So this one is probably the one that has the latest set of new roots. And they're not happy. So I suspect this media's old. So I'm just getting some on my fingers. Yeah, that media's old. So that's the last thing that this sort of plant needs is media that's starting to break down. So that needs repotting as soon as possible. This spike here has been on the plant a while. Yeah, two plants. See the wobble? Yeah, that's one plant. And that is classed as a weak plant. It's got a mature bulb that's not full size, followed by this one that's bloomed before the bulb was ready and has got crinkle leaves, and that's probably because it's lost its where's my scissors gone? Over here. Make yourself comfortable, won't you? And you. That's both of the places that I sit. And the cat's gone from my computer chair onto the settee. As soon as I got off the settee, I put the telly on to watch some news, and as soon as I got up, the cat moved from the computer chair onto the settee where I was sitting before. He just seems to follow me around, little tyke. Anyway, the idea was that spike needs to come off. So we'll take that off. That means the stick can come out. And that relieves a bit of the pressure on this part of the plant. It's wet. Now this recently got watered because I had actually allowed it to get quite dry because of the media. But this separate little plant here, I could take the risk and pull this plant out. It'll make a mess and just leave this other one in. Now this other one has got a new growth. That's weak. That may even fail. So this plant's not in the best of condition. And it needs dealing with, because the longer a Miltoniopsis stays in a stressed state, the less your chance of getting it to recover. So you know, this bulb here is a nice full-size bulb. It bloomed on both sides, and if you see, it had a good root system. I'm just leaning it over because I know the roots only go halfway down in the pot. That is still a reasonable root system, but the whole plant would lift. You see, the roots don't go down any further than that, but there are some. So that is currently in a state where it can be rescued, and I may well have to sacrifice that spike, de-stress it, yeah. But it is two plants, yet again. One of them is weak. That's this one over here. This bit here. I doubt if that's attached. It might be, but because it's been buried so deep in the pot, I suspect that the rhizome between the two is starting to rot. It can be that bad with this type of media. You'll rot the bottom off of these and take the roots with it. So that's a problem that needs dealing with. Right, another new one, and it's another one that we've got two plants in here. Not only have we got two plants, we've got two different ones. Now you could look at that as a bonus, two for the price of one, but I'd have preferred one better plant that I'd actually bought than two different ones and smaller plants. But you know, it's when you start looking at what you've got, I suspect that's two plants. Well, it's definitely two different clones, so it must be two plants. And it looks like the split is there. So the plant that I bought that I wanted has got a small bulb and a larger bulb, and is currently in bloom. And the other bit of the plant is the same. It's got one small bulb and one larger bulb that's in bloom. So when that comes out of the pot, it's going to be two bulbs, one small older one and one other with a full set of leaves on. That's not much of a plant, is it? So that's going to have, those two plants, when they get dealt with, will have to be grown on. They will produce a new growth, providing the roots are okay and it lasts that long. And those two new growths on this plant, which I struggle a bit with Nellie Islas, I've lost quite a few, will not be allowed to bloom. I want another full-size, strong, fully leaved bulb on both of these plants with no stress via the blooms. The next one can be allowed to bloom, because by then, hopefully, we'd have a good root system underneath it. Now, this is in a strange media. I can't lift this out of the pot. It just falls apart. But it's in the cocoa husk and stones. There's lots and lots of stones in here, so in theory, it's aerated. That doesn't stop the cocoa husk going off and taking the root system down, though. So this is an unknown. And the main problem on this is the fact that I've got two small plants, not one reasonable sized one. So that'll be dealt with down the line. And again, if you look up the ancestry of, I think that's now called Oncidium, used to be Buggeriara, something like that. The problem is with they keep reclassifying the elements of the into generics, and I would imagine this possibly had three types of plants in it originally, and one of them got reclassified back into Oncidium, and so these are normally called Oncidiopsis now, and that opsis on the end is a clue to looking after these. It means it's got Miltoniopsis in it. That means it's a cooler grower, and it will be far more sensitive to disturbance, root loss, staying too warm, all the sort of things that will stress this one will stress this one too, because it's got quite a high percentage of Miltoniopsis in it. So there we go. That's a look at some Oncidiums. These giants over here, these are Miltonias, and I haven't got to worry with these apart from possibly coming out of the pot, but they're in good media. They're potted in bark. So when I do these, when I deal with this, is not quite so important. The one from Sarah from Burnham's, the Reginellii, that can stay in its pot. That was recently potted up, so it's in quality bark, and it hasn't long been in it, so that one can stay there. So there we go, a look and a chat about some of the Oncidium alliance. We've been through Brassias, Miltonias, Oncidiums themselves. We had a look at an intergeneric of unknown mix, no pedigree at all, Miltoniopsis hybrid, and an Oncidiopsis that sounds like one of its elements, because it's changed its name, has been reclassified. So, and we had a look at some mounted ones as well. But the main problem with all of the Oncidium alliance, like with all orchids, is getting the timing right to repot. And if you want to be harsh, don't let blooms mess you up. Yeah? If your plant is not going to last another session, and what I mean by a session is a set of new growths maturing and producing a root system, yeah, prior to the next new growth. That's like a season, a session. And if that media isn't going to last long enough for that to happen, then get at it, yeah? Anticipate in advance that your media is not going to last for another season, yeah? Because if you don't deal with it in time and you leave it for that season, that set of new roots that you produce might fail. Like that. Yeah? So try and anticipate. And with the Oncidiums, they vary quite a bit. Some of them produce roots not long after the new growth start, but a lot of them don't even think about producing new roots until the bulbs are at least halfway up. And some of them don't produce their roots until the bulbs are almost mature. Yeah? But you can anticipate, if you've got a reasonable root system that can last another few months and your new growth start, you can wait until you see those new roots. But if your media's gone, you're better off doing it there and then, because you'll lose what you've got anyway. You just as well get them in some new media, and hopefully some of the roots you've already got will branch and start a smaller, but at least some new roots. You tend to get a proper root system from new growths, not from older ones. But nonetheless, some roots on older bulbs can branch and come back into growth, even though they look as though they've gone. So there we go, that's your Oncidiums. And also bear in mind, some Oncidiums don't have an annual season. Their bulbs mature, their cycle, from the start of a new growth to maturing and blooming and the start of the next growth is less than 12 months. It's like sometimes 10 or 11, sometimes only 9. So their flowering period changes, which means their habit will change. Yeah? And your repot, whereas once it was in the spring and it sounded like a great time to do it, might end up being in the middle of winter. So they have a seasonal regression, I call it. Moves backwards. Their blooms come a little bit earlier each year. Some of them are bang on time, almost to the week, and they are genuine annual. But once you get into some of the hybrids, they start doing some strange things. So anyway, there we go. Chat about Oncidium types. And with Oncidium types, when you get to repot, if you're mounting, then that's a totally different subject. Just get on and do it, basically. All the Oncidiums will grow on a mount. It's just that some of them get pretty big. It's up to whether you can keep up with the watering and everything as usual. But you've got some Oncidiums that don't mind getting almost dry that have big fleshy root systems. Well, they do quite well in chunkier mixes. Yeah, you've got some that are giant plants that have got the finest of root systems, and if they dry, those roots will die. They need a fine medium that holds the moisture. So you can't just say this is a suitable media for all Oncidium types, because you can't. Yeah. So there we go. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. So chat about the Oncidiums and the sort of things that can go wrong and how you can anticipate and try and preempt it so that it never does go wrong. Not always as easy as it sounds. I'll see you next time.